You can get anything you want at Alice's restaurant.
And I think it's probably useful to explain just a little bit. So we have Marco here, and he works in slaughterhouses.
She's like a mascot, like an animal.
Yeah.
You know, for Marcos. She's like, in a sense, they're not pairs. And I think that Jasmine is representing all the silenced women in the world.
Yeah.
The women.
Yeah. And I think in this case, in your novel, it's Jasmine is literally treated like meat because she's actually the meat.
Yeah.
You also stopped eating meat at some point, right?
Before
exactly
reading,
yeah
right.
So
it's really difficult to look at the images and to read about how we treat animals. And then when I wrote the book, I just separate myself from my feelings, because if not, I'm a really bad writer because I start crying and I don't stop. So
you can get anything you want at Alice's restaurant.
Do you want to do the intro, Aaron, or should I?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay. Welcome back, listeners, to Between the Covers.
Oh, yeah.
Another book review. This week we're talking with Mike Hilbig about a book called Tender as the Flesh by Augusting Bazterrica. Not guaranteeing that's an appropriate pronunciation.
Oh, there it is.
There's the book Aaron's showing you. It's a very disturbing dystopian horror. So we will let Mike talk about what made him bring this book to our attention.
Well, we should have the disclaimer up front. This book is for adults.
It involved societal cannibalism. It's very disturbing, and it's kind of, especially like maybe the first half for me, it was kind of a bit of a slog because it felt so depressed. The main character is so sad and just disconnected from himself even. So, and that was my personal, but there is humans be eating humans. So and all the animals have been killed, or at least that's
they're all poisonous.
Right. Well, but people hunt them to kill them, to get rid of them, because they are poisonous to humans by bite, by contact, and by consumption.
Okay,
So go ahead, Mike.
I had actually I read this book during I was in a book club during sort of the height of COVID, just as like something to do online, like a Zoom book club, and we were reading a lot of speculative fiction by particularly women writers of color. We were sort of trying to like branch out and expand our horizons, and this one came up in my Goodreads queue, and so I suggested it to the book club. I think it actually, because I think this time around it was actually a little harder to get through. I'm probably one of the only people that's read this book twice. So we read it during the pandemic. I think it actually might have, like, because everything was so depressing during the height of the pandemic, that in some ways it wasn't as disturbing to read during that as it was this time around, as life has gotten a lot better. For me personally, but I do think this book is, I really, I mean, I don't know if like is the right word for it. I think this book is really well written, and I think it makes some pretty culturally relevant points about dehumanization. The writer is Argentinian, and so this book is, I'm assuming, based in Argentina, but this was written a few years back, and I don't know if y'all are familiar with the Argentinian landscape, but they just elected a sort of fascist clown as Javier Milei as the leader of Argentina. He's sort of like Trump to the 10th power or something like that kind of figure.
Sort of a nationalist kind of.
Yeah, sort of. And this writer has given interviews and talks about how this, she is a vegetarian, so I think there's some of that politics in this book, although I don't think that's really the point. So it's a future. It's a future where I'll kind of explain a little more than go into detail before I sort of break it down. So it's a future world where, as Lisa had pointed out, the meat has become poisonous. There's actually a pandemic that spreads, and humans start resorting to eating other humans. And when they do this, they breed certain people as cattle. They brand them. They take out their vocal cords so they can't scream. And there's a lot of pretty graphic descriptions of that in the book. But the book, I think, also on a deeper level, the book talks about language a lot, like the words that we use to describe people, the words that we use to describe practices. So they don't call these humans humans; they call them heads, like heads of cattle. They call the meat special meat. They have all these sort of euphemisms that they use to sort of allow them to sort of work through the guilt around it. And I think, I think for me, I think that as we're living through this moment where there's this situation happening in Palestine and other conflicts around the world as well, right? There's a lot of sort of these foreign countries where Western interventionism has sort of destroyed the political landscape, and we extract a lot of resources from them, and we sort of put bad people in charge, and people get murdered. And I think if living in America, there's a lot of people that sort of just kind of put their blinders on and go about their lives, and I think that there's a similar quality to that, to what's going on. I mean, this book is a more extreme version of that, but there's a similar quality to that, and like what's going on in this book, where that people are just sort of not acknowledging sort of the hell they live under. There's a scene towards the end of the book where the
scavengers.
So there's these people called scavengers. They live like outside of this meat processing plant, and they sort of throw them a head with a human over the wall every once in a while to satiate them. You get the idea that they're probably like what we might consider like a homeless person or something along that lines, right, in our society. And they sort of attack a truck and take a bunch of meat. And the person in charge of this processing plant is like, we just have to kill them all because we can't deal with this sort of these attacks on us, right? And they're sort of putting the blame on these scavengers rather than the blame on the society itself for having resorted to this practice that has sort of made everything corrosive. And the narrator of this book is a guy named Marcos, who's a sort of, he runs one of the plants, and he doesn't like what's going on, and he talks a lot about the language that's used and how these people are all ignoring it, but he's also involved in it as well. And his marriage has just recently fallen apart after his wife and him suffered the death of a small child after having tried really hard to get pregnant. And his father is in he's in a nursing home. Sorry, not a mental hospital. His father's in a nursing home, but his father has sort of lost his mind, and he thinks of his father as a good man, and you kind of, he's not there's really no good characters in this book, but I think the book kind of tries to trick you into having some empathy or sympathy for Marcos because of what he's gone through. And then I don't know if we want to get into the end of it just yet, but at the end it sort of flips that around on the reader. So I just kind of think that this book makes some interesting cultural points about what it takes to live in our sort of, we often talk about being grateful for living in a country where we have the resources that we need, but we don't necessarily think about what that means in terms of how the rest of the world gets exploited at the hands of that. And I think that this book, it's not written about America necessarily, but it is written about that sort of overall trend of sort of like the people in power. How do they make decisions that affect us all, and then what does that look like in people's personal lives? I think that there's a lot of sort of metaphorical qualities to that I think are interesting. Like I said, having read it the second time around, I was feeling a little bad for having brought it up, but I do think it's also about cannibalism, so you can have a kind of fun conversation about it. It's got some pretty out there scenes in it. But in any case, I'll let somebody else kind of give their thoughts.
One thing I'll say is that you're not alone. This book was extremely hard to get hold of at the library. The wait was something like 35 weeks or something.
Yeah.
When I put it on hold, and there was like 60 copies or something. It was ridiculous. Yeah. And then you know, later I found out it was on YouTube. But anyway, we went ahead and purchased a copy. But I thought it was interesting. You said,
Yeah, and I audiobook. So
I thought it was
I
interesting that you said that it doesn't
That's
really
what we did.
concentrate on the animal rights aspect, because I felt like that was the overriding thing. And Lisa disagreed with me. So Lisa was more, but in your
I think
camp, I
it was
guess.
more commentary on society and how
Yeah.
quickly we switched. I mean, it feels like it says years later, and yes, some of the cattle have been raised from birth, apparently. So we've got adult heads.
Yeah.
So, but it feels like it's both been a while, but it's still new. It's definitely the same generation. The children of these people have probably never eaten animal flesh.
Didn't
Yeah,
the
that
writer,
You
he
know,
has that
and
scene with
the
his
idea that it keeps throwing hope at you, but you almost don't want there to be hope.
yeah,
didn't
I
the
think
writer
It's
say
such
that,
a horrific idea.
I
I'm
think it
sorry.
does have some. I think it does have. I definitely think it does have some politics of sort of vegetarianism in there.
Yeah.
Me personally, I'm not a vegetarian. I do try to eat about half my meals vegetarian. I don't necessarily. I'm not necessarily against eating meat in the um, in the philosophical sense, but I do think there's a lot of problems with sort of capitalist factory farming, the way that industry is run. When you learn a little bit about it does kind of horrify you a bit. So I do think that's definitely in there. But to me, the most telling commentary, I think for me, I think it's because it's to me it seems like an intentional choice by the writer. There's a lot of like just overt discussion of words we use. Lots of sections of the book where he talks about these are the kind of words that these people use, and these are the kind of words that these people use. And so to me, it's really, I think, the meta commentary, which if anybody is unfamiliar with what that word means, I mean, meta is just like a concept that means sort of self-aware. So a story that's self-aware of itself being a story. It talks a lot about the language that it uses within the context of the story itself. So I think to me that just feels very intentional, and that feels like sort of the main point the writer is getting at to me. But yeah.
Didn't she? Okay, so the writer is quoted as saying, making the association of cannibalism with capitalism,
Yeah.
right? To paraphrase what she said, that cannibalism is a lot like capitalism, I think is
Yeah.
what she said.
And the way people have kind of like you have to wonder if some of the people that are more enthusiastic, like for instance the leather manufacturer, if you will,
Yeah,
uh
there's a lot of um, in sort of literary studies, which is sort of what I got my master's degree in creative writing, but it took a lot of literary theory classes, and there's a lot of theorists who write these commentaries about like who do we grieve and how do we grieve, and those things being sort of political. And I think to me, what I was thinking of when I brought this book in, I've been pretty involved in sort of pro-Palestinian organizing in Houston, and when you watch the way the Western media sort of covers how that event is unfolding, you see these like differences in the ways that when Israeli citizens are attacked by Hamas, right? It's Israelis were killed, and when Palestinians are attacked by Israel, it's often this many Palestinians died, right? And so that active versus passive voice, and I think that really comes across in this book, right? There's this scene where his father has passed away, and it was interesting. They cremate him like the same day, and they started doing that because they don't want people to like attack a hearse on the way to the funeral home. But his father gets a funeral, or something like a funeral. Certain people are allowed the opportunity to be grieved, whereas these cattle are sort of cattle who are really humans are just sort of like tossed away, and nobody really knows what's happened to them, or even acknowledges that they're a person. So I think that's kind of like that was kind of what I was thinking when I brought the book in. I think that this book does a good job of sort of talking about the language that we use. Who do we grieve? Why do we grieve them? There's they talked about like there was a reference to the Americans being worried that, you know, when India, or not Americans, Argentinians, I guess, but people in the West being worried that when India started, you know, selling cattle as well, and they started allowing them to sell it on foreign markets, and because they have this giant population, that it was going to bring down the cost of their meat, you know. And so I think that those kinds of, you know, when you think about those associations, and I think when you think about this, you know, when we talk about capitalism being cannibalism, right? I think when you think about that, is Israel and Palestine, like what is Israel's function in sort of the world economy? I mean, they're really, you know, sort of a lot, in a lot of ways, a proxy government for US sort of controlling the oil interests in the Middle East, right? And so I think that that's kind of a thing that this book, to me, has some resonances with what's happening in the world right now in terms of, and it's not just Israel and Palestine. I mean, these kinds of conflicts in a lot of places in Africa and Asia. There's a lot of, you know, sort of the way that the U.S. military sort of runs its operations and works with other governments. There are a lot of people that get dehumanized in the process of that, and I think that this book does a good job of showing that.
And that's kind of speaks to one of the things that I noticed a long time ago in the news. 18-year-old man killed in versus teenager, 18-year-old teenager killed,
Yeah.
or 19-year-old teenager.
Yeah.
And I mean, you know, it speaks to, I know at one point for me, it spoke to somewhat racism.
Yeah.
Because the black kid killed in whatever neighborhood, let's say Avondale, is a man, but the white kid killed in wherever is a teenager.
Yeah, and I think this book,
So
it doesn't,
and they're both 18.
in the
Right.
book, it doesn't talk a ton about it necessarily, but it does definitely have some, you get the sense that the people that are being farmed as cattle are, you know, people that we would consider, you know, marginalized populations currently, right? It's also an interesting book because I think, as Lisa pointed out, it hasn't been going on a super long time. Also, it's not set in some distant future world. It feels still very much like the world we live in today. So you know, if you would like to like extrapolate it, you know, if COVID had happened, you know, it's like, and it had caused an animal, you know, population drop off, right? Like that would be like maybe 20 years down the road or something like that. It's not like some super long time in the distant future. So yeah.
Don't you?
It's not the distant past either, because Marcos worked in animal slaughterhouses.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Don't you find this whole narrative in the book that certain
I don't find it to be an animal rights book necessarily. I mean, there's nobody speaking on behalf of any animals in this.
Well, except for maybe Marcos with the
there's
dogs.
kind of an there's
He
an
finds the
absence of
puppies.
protests, right? There's not
there's
big opposition to what's going on.
There's puppy abuse going on by those kids, but I guess that's the only animal rights bit, but it's not about eating puppies or eating animals.
Right.
Yeah. That was noticeable to me. But don't you think that this whole idea that they try to present this narrative that certain types of people are more delectable than others? You know, it
like this flesh
that can't possibly be true?
Well, there's the people that wanted pregnant females to hunt.
Yeah, that shit, it was totally
and then
lie.
there's the tanneries wanted black skin, things like that.
Yeah, well,
but
I mean,
when I'm sorry, go ahead.
And I was gonna say too, we should point out like that you know, I guess we should probably leave a disclaimer that, like, you know, if you want to read the book, you should read, because we might spoil some certain things.
We spoil all the books on between
but there's a scene towards the end where it sort of starts to become apparent that this virus might have even been made up by the government, that they're just using it as a way to sort of control people.
They mentioned that even in the beginning, like, well, that's the official government line, that the animals are poison.
Yeah, and so
that's what COVID was for.
Yeah, so it might have been happening for no reason at all. Yeah, so yeah, I mean, yeah, so I think it does have the writer herself is a vegetarian, and she is active in sort of animal rights movements. But I don't think it's. I mean, I think that
not primarily.
Yeah, but I think that, like, and I think that the factory farming aspect of this book, I think that a lot of those descriptions, you could, if you substituted animals for humans, it rings true for like how meat is actually probably processed,
Yeah,
right? That she's probably done
I
some
wanted
research on it.
I wanted our friend Jeff Demery to be on this episode because he grew up with his father working in a slaughterhouse in
Yeah.
Okay.
Cincinnati, and then
Oh.
he worked at it in the summers.
He would have
His
been great.
first couple years of college.
Yeah.
So I thought his input would be pretty interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that would have been.
He didn't seem to have time. He just didn't. He ran out of time to read the book, as I recall, is what he said. He
Yeah.
hadn't read the book before, and
Yeah,
but he would have
he's
been
a
great.
teacher and had his hands full.
I think there's
And
definitely.
That would have almost been, yeah, we need to do his book.
let's plug his book right here.
We haven't, I haven't been able to read it yet because somebody's been scheduling authors left and right.
There we go.
The
Jeff
Escape from
Demery.
the Kill Floor.
Right.
Mhm.
It's our friend Jeff, saxophonist extraordinaire, teacher of young minds.
And I do intend to read his book. I just haven't had a chance to yet. Because somebody keeps scheduling books.
Yeah. Don't you love the world? I love books, and I get into, if I like science fiction or I like any kind of alternate reality books, I love the world building aspects of it.
Mm.
And that's why I think that this is effective. You talked about the
Yeah, it creates this whole world.
the
Yeah.
subtlety of the language, the implications of the
And
the metaphor.
special kidneys and hands are a special upper extremity, and feet are special lower extremity.
Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
I can't say that I love the details, but
Yeah.
those are the types of things that I enjoy about dystopian fiction. And then sometimes when it gets beyond the world building, when it gets into the story, that's where my mind drifts.
Mm.
It's like,
I think
this is really cool. This is a cool world they built. I'm living in this world, and then it's like the details become extraneous.
It's a completely different, probably political angle, but like to me, this book really reminds me of like Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, which is a pretty hard book to read as well. It's that's a book about sort of the conquest of Texas, right? and sort of trying to
due to the lack of punctuation.
No, I mean, I'd say
Cormac McCarthy joke.
That's that for some people that's difficult. I don't find that as difficult as others do, but I think for me that book is. I mean, he's also probably his writing style is much more elevated. This book is actually pretty easy to read. I think in terms of just like. It's hard to read because of the content, but I mean, in terms of the sentences, it's pretty simple.
I blew through it in like 3 sittings, I think.
Yeah.
I should say that it was written in Spanish. This is a translation. And I like that the nature, he's repetitive. Marcos, the narrator, is repetitive sometimes. It's pretty basic, pretty mundane kind of descriptions of extraordinary things.
The concepts are so big, though.
Yeah, but I'd say that the reason it reminds me of Blood Meridian is just like Blood Meridian is a really graphically violent book about Texas conquest, and it's and I had to read that book I think 4 times for different literature classes I took throughout my undergrad and grad school career in college, and people just had really pretty violent reactions to the violence in the book, and everybody that I've known who's read this book has tended to have they tend to have liked the fact that they read it and understand the message that's being given, but don't necessarily enjoy the book. So
it's not pleasure reading.
Yeah, and I think that's like a there are books that you read for just sort of on a purely entertainment level, right? And then there are books that sort of have a wider point. And I think that this book definitely has a real philosophical viewpoint. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, not just capitalism. I think there's a real. So we should get in a little bit to more details of the book. So in this book, because I think it's really makes a real statement about sort of patriarchy as well. So in the book, Marcos has been given this cattle to hold on to from his slaughterhouse. He's got it in the barn at his house, and he has just lost a child. And what sort of the course of the first part of the book is sort of just kind of detailing what's happening at this factory. That for the most part, it kind of goes through the world building of that. And then the second part of the book, it gets into sort of what's going on with this cattle he's keeping at the house, and he eventually rapes this woman that he's got out in the barn. He cleans her up and then rapes her and impregnates her. And at the end of the book, he calls his wife, who his marriage has, they aren't divorced, but she's been living with her mother, and sort of grieving this child that they've lost. And his wife is a nurse, and so he calls his wife when this cattle has a sort of complication with her pregnancy to come over, and they deliver the baby, and then they decide that they're going to raise this baby together, because it's illegal in this world. It's illegal to they call it enjoying the cattle, but yeah, it's illegal to have sex with the cattle you have. So
have sex with the food.
Yeah, so if he
They
gets,
have to keep it dehumanized.
Marcos would be put to death for this.
yeah, and so he kills the cattle, and his wife and him decide that they're going to raise this baby together. It's a real shift in sort of the way that Marcos has been portrayed throughout the book, is that he's every bit complicit in all this death and destruction that's happening,
Right.
but he has a problem with it.
He raped this woman.
Yeah.
We saw some stuff on YouTube where the reviewers were saying he fell in love with this woman. I don't think that's not the case.
No.
She had no vocal
No.
cords. She really had no.
He used her
she was
for
just
his own sexual satisfaction.
an object to him.
Yeah.
Was just, because she wasn't human to him.
And there are no heroes, and there are no heroes in this book. Marcos is not like.
Mhm.
He's not like he
He's
doesn't.
not the good guy.
He's not. He doesn't have a taste for. So to speak, for what he's doing. It really turns his stomach in some ways, but he's not a champion or anything of that nature.
Yeah, I think so. I think like what so I think there's a real commentary on sort of on the sort of relation. There's a not just on a societal level. I think what this part of the book is kind of getting at, because he's dealing with his father who's dying. He has sort of a tenuous relationship with his sister. I think what it's showing is like when you have these sort of extremely sort of selfish, violent systems that sort of operate the world that you live in, it bleeds into your personal relationships, right? And so, I think in addition to sort of like using this woman, it's not just to like get this child back, but it's also to sort of like rebuild this emotional bond that he's lost with his wife, right? So it's like using somebody else's trauma as a way to like repair your own trauma. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's like something along that lines, right? So I think that as narrative sort of, some of them are more useful than others. Sort of online psychology narratives are always sort of dangerous to delve too deeply into, but I do think there has been a lot of sort of discussion about things like trauma, things like sort of how do you heal from your trauma, what's your responsibility to heal from your trauma, what happens when your trauma affects your other relationships, and I think that this book kind of shows that if you have this sort of larger system, this sort of larger selfish system in place, that a lot of times what ends up happening is that people who have been abused and are being abused and are abusers, like that cycle kind of forms from this, like I have this emotional pain and now I'm going to inflict it on somebody else to sort of heal my own emotional pain. And I think that's something that sort of connects the personal level to the sort of political level that I think that this book is doing. I think it does pretty well, actually. In terms
he did give her a name. He called her Jasmine because she smelled like jasmine in his mind.
Probably because he put jasmine shampoo or something on her.
Well, and paradoxically, right? This is one of the things in the book that I think is interesting, right? At least until he actually kills her, right? Until she delivers this baby and he kills her, like even though that relationship is still a power imbalance, and even though he still has the ability to sort of lock her in his room when he leaves the house and that sort of stuff, like she is actually living a better life than she would be living if she was still stuck at this this slaughterhouse facility. So
before he moved her into the house, she was living in his barn. She had no clothes, and he was washing her by just spraying her with a hose. So and as Gen Xer, I know I've been sprayed with the hose. I have a sibling.
Yeah, I've been sprayed down with a hose before as
Yeah.
well. That was something that
And even my mom did it post swimming pool. She would spray it with the hose
yeah, that
in the
was
yard before we were allowed to go in the house.
yeah.
So
But it was yeah. So I think this book does a good. I mean, I think it's pretty successful in terms of if we were all not grossed out by the book, I think it would sort of miss its mark. But I think it's pretty successful in sort of and I know that some of the people in the online chat we were having around the book as we were kind of getting ready for the podcast were struggling with some of the sparseness of the writing style. I actually really liked that. I really liked the style of the prose in this book. I thought it was effective for what she was trying to do. I think I think that that sort of simplicity of the language. And again, it's a translation, so I have not
Yeah.
read the original in Spanish and don't know what the difference would be. But I think it's the short sort of clipped sentences kind of go along with sort of the sort of overly simplistic, um, oftentimes overly simplistic narratives that we tell about things that then allow us to um, cover up a lot of dehumanization and violence that happens in our own world. So I think I think that's the reason it's written in that style. So
Yeah, I guess it was written in 2017, and I found it interesting that the English translation came in 2020.
yeah, did Lisa and Phil cut out?
No, we're still
Their
Oh,
video's
okay.
off. They're
Okay,
still
cool.
here.
just turn the video off for a second.
Cool.
But yeah, talked about
The twist
the
ending,
speed with which. Go ahead, Aaron.
I kind of saw that coming. I had two ideas in mind for how it was going to end. One was that he was going to kill her, and the other was that she was going to eat the baby.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That well, maybe. Yeah, yeah. That's interesting take. That didn't occur to me, but that would have been pretty stunning, pretty startling for that to happen.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting the way you have to take some things for granted. Like we talked about the lack of like, if this were to happen, anything like this were to happen in America, the resistance to it would be uh, incredibly intense. I mean, it would just
I don't
be.
know.
Yeah,
If
so I
if
think
Trump was in office and this happened, people would be eating humans tomorrow if he told them to.
I think
You
it's
might be right there.
I think that there's a I mean I think this is one of those I think that like when I mean it's changed, right? So that when I started getting involved in this sort of Palestinian work, right, in sort of October, November, when October 7th happened and sort of the immediate aftermath, it took a little while for people to sort of understand what was happening. And I think a lot of that's because of how the media covers it, right? It doesn't cover that equally, right? It sort of and and this is not to say that right there are bad actors in any conflict or any sort of there are going to be bad actors and there's going to be people that do things that are not cool, right? But I think like there's just a fundamental difference in having a nuclear power state that's attacking people versus like having a group with like homemade rockets and rocks, and so I think it's just and the death tolls are very very unequal. And so like I think like there was just a lot of people that just didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to think about it. And I think that we also tend to not um, we often think of conflicts that happen overseas as something that's happening over there. But a lot of that stuff does trickle into our own society, right? So, for instance, Palestine or Gaza Strip is where weapons manufacturers test out a ton of surveillance equipment, right? And they end up using that on American borders, right?
Well, I read it described as an open air prison.
Yeah, and so they use that technology in borders across the world. When we think about um, like a country like Bolivia, which a few years ago the American government got caught trying to interfere in their elections, and Bolivia was actually able to overcome that. But the reason for that is that there's these lithium mines in Bolivia, and lithium is a hot commodity in terms of like how we make batteries for cell phones and computers and that sort of thing. So the way that our lives are structured is often on these sort of like extractive practices that American corporations use overseas. And if you and it's depressing to think about. I'm not trying to say that everybody should spend all their time consumed with with thinking about that stuff. But I think that that we can kind of live our lives in America, kind of just going through the motions and not really pay attention to the ways in which, because we don't really have to, that our military is used to sort of extract resources from other countries, and that that there's a lot of violence behind that. And so I think
that's the dark side of capitalism. Behind most of these political situations are driven by some sort of business interests. It's not necessarily humanitarian cause that we get intervene, that we position ourselves possibly with a place like Israel,
and I think that I mean this doesn't necessarily have to do with the book, but I think like in terms of why I find myself active in these kinds of struggles, and I work with a socialist party that's trying to undo capitalism, right? I think that the reason I get involved in this kind of stuff is that I think that it really does have more, like, I think this actually is in the book. I think that the sort of commentary on how it affects our personal relationships is real. I think that we do tend to live in a pretty selfish, individualistic culture that doesn't that a lot of people are alienated from each other, right? They're not really living in these ways in which they're living in this sort of like just for consumption, right? I make myself satisfied or happy by going out and buying the next thing, right? And I don't do that.
Send my garbage to Malaysia.
Yeah, I don't do that by investing in my family and friends. I'm not saying everybody's like that. There's still a lot of people that do that as well. But I mean, I think that is a trend that happens in this country that is
cannibalize those people.
Yeah, and so I think that one of the reasons that I find myself, I think that, so there's a famous theory called boomerang theory, which basically says that if you're living in sort of an imperial power, and we should mention that this book takes place in Argentina, which is a little bit different, but Latin America has largely, and I think in general, one of the reasons I really like Latin American fiction, I read lots of Latin American fiction. What happened in from the, I'd say probably it really goes back to like the late 1800s, but really during the early part of the 20th century, there was just a ton of, and also the late 20th century with Reagan and whatnot, but there's just a ton of meddling in Latin American countries and propping up sort of the worst people to run the country because they kind of give American corporations the cheapest, deal on their resources. I mean,
Manuel Noriega.
Chiquita Banana, which used to be the U.S. Fruit Company, is responsible for something like 5 or 6 different genocides that took place in Latin America from the 1950s to the 1980s. And
Phil and I worked for United Dairy Farmers, which was owned by the owner of Chiquita Banana.
Yeah, and so there's this theory called boomerang theory that says, when you're in imperial power, and your military is doing this stuff overseas, they're learning those tactics. So right now in America, there's a facility being developed in Atlanta called Cops. It's called Cop City. It's an urban warfare training facility, and a lot of
shut it down. They didn't.
I think it's still like it's in the development stage. It's not open yet, and there's a lot of sort of blowback about it and protests. I'm not sure exactly where the line is on how close it is to being developed or not. But there are actually a lot of cities that are trying to develop cities or facilities like this, and we also know that like the NYPD has offices in Jerusalem for some reason, and that Israeli troops train American police, right? And so what you see is that these things that happen overseas really do have effect in our own society, because they end up getting as countries learn these strategies. I mean, in Latin America, when the American military there's a school called the School of the Americas, which was a training facility for Latin American generals that that they would bring them to America and train them about how to control populations, and then
It's
send them back
turned
to their
back
own.
on.
Yeah.
Boomerang effect.
And so you end up with, like, when 2020, when the George Floyd protests happened and police are spraying tear gas and using these different kinds of techniques, these are techniques that the American military has learned overseas, right? And so and there's a lot of sort of theorization that, like, what happened in Europe during World War I and World War II was really was a conflict of European imperialism sort of going into decay. And you had these imperial powers sort of squaring off with each other, trying to fight over land holdings. And that, within that, things like the liberation of Jewish people happened, but that was not really the point of that war. That war was really over sort of these colonial holdings. And Europe sort of exploded in this massive violence. And I think, I think in America, we're not quite at that level yet, but there is a lot of violence. I mean, I think that, like, something like school shootings or like some of these extremely violent acts that we see in our country are really a result of sort of the ways in which our ideology can be pretty corrosive and toxic when you take sort of individualism to its most
sort of a reflection
extreme.
Of
yeah. And so you can account for a lot of that violence just by kind of thinking about, well, how are the ideological structures of our society held up? I mean,
let's bring it back to the book a little
bit.
Yeah,
for sure.
Okay, so the book sort of it normalizes the violence in the book, and it seems to me when I'm looking at it, a lot of younger people are more accepting of that. The popularity of it is evident in this the inability to get a hold of a copy sometimes in some instances.
Yeah.
But so yeah, I think the book, I think you're right. You're on the right, you're on the right bead there. That the book is definitely topical to events that are going on in the world right now, and the way that the way that things are going, especially on the right.
Yeah, I was having trouble I was trying to look for, before we did this, and I found a couple little snippets, but I was trying to look for some commentary from the writer on, and she's been openly critical of Javier Milei, who is the current president of Argentina, and I don't know enough about that that individual political struggle to comment in depth on it.
Is the book kind of geared towards Argentinian politics or global politics?
I think personally, right? I mean, I think there's probably some things about Argentina in this book that I'm not necessarily picking up on because I don't know enough about what's happened there specifically. But I think that just in general, the way that I look at politics, I think that oftentimes we sort of gloss over the geopolitical context. I think geopolitical contexts frame a lot of what happens in individual countries, and that you could really look at capitalism as a system that sort of supersedes nationalism, right? Like I mean, it creates nationalisms, but these countries, I mean, America, Britain, Germany, France, they often work as a block together, right? They have some individual differences, but in terms of how they act internationally, they often, work as a team, right? And so, and so I think that when you think about Latin America, I think it's not quite as it's because they're being controlled by American corporate interests more so than, it's not necessarily to say that their political systems are entirely under the thumb of the American government, but what the American government does has lots of influence over what
has a ripple effect.
Yeah. And so I think that in a lot of ways, I think that you could extrapolate a lot that's happening in this book and read it through the lens of a different, like living in America, even though the book doesn't take place there. Yeah. So
do you think it loses anything in translation, or do you think that? But see, I feel like the narrative, I know we talked about it already, but I feel like you can't stress enough that the narrative is very kind of antiseptic, very perfunctory, kind of very times repetitive. And I feel like that's effective for this story. But do you feel like that is attributable to the skill of the writer, or is it the translation?
Well, so I actually took a translation course in undergrad. I was a creative writing minor in undergrad, and translation is we don't often talk about it this way, but translation is its own form of sort of creative writing, right? Like that it's what you end up with when you translate a book is you end up with two different books, but I mean one's in the spirit of the other one, but you're never translation is too difficult to do one to one. There's lots of different theories about, are you shooting for accuracy in terms of conveying the actual words on the page? Are you trying to, go for more like across languages? There's different idioms, right? So, like expressions like raining cats and dogs or something. So if you see an idiom in Spanish that wouldn't make sense in English, then what idiom do you use to replace that idiom? Those kinds of things. So oftentimes when you're reading a translation, what you're reading is the work of the translator. So I'm sure that there are things that are different between this one and the source material. But I also think that when you get a book like this that's pretty widely celebrated, right, that the translators they use to do these are pretty widely regarded, like people that have done a lot of translation work and are well adept at doing it. You also see there's new translations that come out of older works. So there was a pretty celebrated, I forget the woman's name, but there was a new translation of the Odyssey and the Iliad that came out
about a year ago.
It was a year, maybe a couple years, but yeah. So and it's kind of like gives you a new angle as people continue to study these works. People get new information about them, get new perspectives on them. Oftentimes too, when you're thinking about the translator has to be thinking about the context of what readers in a different society will be reading about it. So it's possible there's some different differences in it. I wouldn't be able to comment on it because I haven't read the original in Spanish. I know enough. I live in Texas, so it's like I know enough Spanish to go into a store or a restaurant where people don't speak a lot of English and order for myself, but I don't know enough Spanish to hold a conversational Spanish. I have read.
I know enough to get my ass kicked.
Yeah, I've read a couple books in Spanish, just like as an exercise in doing it. But they're books that I'm highly familiar with the English version. So like Jorge Luis Borges is a writer that I really love, who is also from Argentina, and he has a collection of short stories called Labyrinths, and I've read the Spanish version of that. I did not get as much from it, but I knew the English version well enough that I could kind of sift through it and pick apart some words that I didn't know. But yeah, so I think there's always translation's an interesting. When you take a translation course, you realize just like how
it can be controlled, how it can be manipulated.
Well, how rich that sort of tradition is. That we tend to, when we read books in translation, we tend to just use the author's name. But in the translation community, there are translators that are really well known, and some are better than others. And people have.
Isn't English typically more complex? I guess, and like I'll hear things that are translated, and I can't think of a perfect example, but maybe. A word like association.
Yeah,
you got the Shohei Ohtani thing.
So yeah,
where,
English
that somebody caught his home run ball, and the translator mistranslated what Ohtani said. What Ohtani said in Japanese was, these people have been spoken to, and they've gotten the ball back, and he translated it as "I spoke with these people," and it caused a kerfuffle.
The English is as a result of its history, both its ancient history and its more modern history. There's actually a lot of scholars that say there's 7 different kinds of English. So there's like American English, there's British English, there's Indian English, and that if you were to go to India and listen to people speak English, there's just like the idioms are so different that sometimes it's almost like a foreign language. But so English was, it was first adapted by the Anglo-Saxons in Britain who were invaded by what was the name? It was by the French.
The Normans?
The Normans. And at that period of time, a bunch of sort of French influence came into language, which French at the time is sort of a vulgar form of Latin. So a lot of Latinate words come into the language. And then you have these Norse invaders who are sacking Britain as well, and bringing Norwegian words into the language. And then, as the British Empire begins to build, it goes out to all these different places. And it colonizes people and brings new sorts of indigenous people in, and those languages then have influence on English. So English is
German and
in
everything.
terms of
More
other languages tend to stick much more closely to their rules and their spellings and their sort of.
right,
And English
right.
doesn't have that because it has this influence of all these different languages in it as a result of
I before E
conquest.
except after C or sounding like A.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Um,
I mean, letters having two pronunciations, and other letters in the word that have an effect on the
yeah.
previous letter. Like
Well,
the
that's
ph
probably
sound.
normal from language to language, but
Yeah. So,
Okay.
but yeah. So, do we want to unpack any specific scenes that resonate with y'all, or anything that y'all want
um,
to?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
wanted to
yeah.
bring up the sister's head that she was keeping and the death by 1,000 cuts that
Oh
they
yeah,
were
yeah.
doing. So I guess the idea is they keep her kind of refrigerated and cut bits out of her every time there's a party or an event and somehow keep her alive.
Kind of like a cheat.
Yeah. And it was
That was
told
disturbing.
that this was a that
I
this
want
was
to
a
take that back as soon as
that this was a practice of the upper class, right? That
Mhm.
this was like having your own
Status
personal
symbol. Yeah.
cattle is, yeah, as a status symbol, and that he has a Marcos, the main character, has a sort of critique of his sister as being sort of shallow and going along to getting along, and he mentions at some point. So this was actually kind of similar to COVID, right? His sister is obsessed with, and it says that people in the cities are obsessed. Everybody carries umbrellas around because they're worried that, like, if a bird shits on you, that, like, you'll contract this pandemic virus that's been going around. Um, and Marcos thinks it's kind of stupid or whatever. So it kind of resonated to me with sort of masks and COVID and some of that kind of political dialogue. But yeah, his sister is definitely a member of the upper class, and is
yeah.
sort of obsessed with what other people
Kind
think.
of cavalier about the whole thing. Kind of
Yeah. And Marcos thinks she's shallow and doesn't care, and I think
right.
that the book is, again, with the final scene in which Marcos is sort of does the sort of most horrific thing that happens in the book. I think that it kind of turns that around as well, like
Yeah.
that, like, just sort of sitting on the sidelines and feeling bad about the stuff you're doing
But
doesn't really
we
do
talked
anything.
about that there's really no heroes in this, and I feel
Yeah,
like there's one criticism of the book. It's that they're somewhat one-dimensional characters. That, for instance, the scientist, the Mangala type
Yeah.
female
Dr.
yeah,
Velka.
scientist, she was just man, just repulsive.
Yeah.
Real.
I was going
and
to bring
I
her up next.
yeah, I think that
I'll let
I
you
think
talk about
I think for me, it's written in the third person, but it's what we call a close third person perspective, which means that, like, we don't really get a lot of access to what other characters are thinking except for Marcos, right? So
it. Right.
the book is really written from his perspective. It just isn't written in his voice. I think that a lot of that, like, sort of one dimensionality of the characters has to do more with sort of Marcos, to me, sort of strikes me as a character with very sort of black and white thinking,
Mhm.
and that's like a result of that. I kind of felt like that about this book. I also think that that's you know um,
Cool.
the way that the writer is sort of handling this is sort of building these tropes of different people you would see in a society, and so sort of like using those to sort of
What about
illuminate.
the game where you take they have celebrities and they release them to the wild and hunt them like wild game or something? I mean,
Yeah.
that's like
Yeah,
right out of Gilligan's Island. It's like
yeah.
I remember an episode like that. That's very tropey.
Yeah, so yeah, and there's yeah, the boss at the or not the boss, the person who does all the dismembering at the factory. And
Mhm.
Marcos also talks about, like, they did this hiring process with these two guys, and one of them was
Overzealous.
a little too eager
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
participate in it, and he talked about how he didn't like to hire people that were overly eager because it created problems.
Nobody should enjoy this
He,
work.
he busted him taking video too.
Yeah, but it's also so in this society, so that the meat industry has become like one of the bigger industries out there, and so the processing plant that Marcos works at is considered sort of one of the high end processing plants. There's a character at one point that he meets who he used to work with and who's known as sort of a sort of prestige meat. He was the one that was having the hunt of the people, but like he also raises cattle, and they got into some conflicts because he was sort of doctoring the meat and selling it without, they have different like rating systems the same way that we do, USDA choice, Wagyu, all that kind of stuff, right? Like they had different rating systems, and he was sort of selling things that were lower rating as higher rating. So there's like that's going on as well, and that the people that work these jobs in the processing plant. I mean, I think in our society, right? Like I think you mentioned knowing somebody who worked at a slaughterhouse, but I would think like it's not considered any kind of a glamour job. But you get the sense that in this world, it's kind of considered a glamour job or whatever. There's also a commentary on, which we didn't talk a lot about, but there's a commentary on sort of overpopulation, right? Which I actually think is one of those tricky things, right? As the planet we live on now does have the resources to sustain the population that we have. So I think that critiques of overpopulation can be overblown. But what happens in this book is that as people start dying off, and from this pandemic, and then as people are farmed and then killed off, right, that it creates this population dip, and that in the context of the book, this actually, causes some problems to go away. So you get a sense that there's like less environmental problems, less things like that as a result of the population shrinking, and that for the people that are not cattle, right, that they have sort of more resources to go around, that probably the people who are living in cities and working professional jobs are living pretty cushy lives. So I mean that's kind of a thing that the book talks about some, that I'm not sure is the most poignant critique or anything like that. I think it's more a world building type thing. But that is a thing that's happened in this book as well.
Yeah. You mentioned something in the thread that I thought was observant, interesting. You feel like that if a man had wrote this, the blowback would have been off the charts, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I found myself at certain moments. I don't know, but I found myself at certain moments in this book. Some of the ways, especially in which he's interacting with his cattle that doesn't have vocal cords, and who he is impregnated. The voice in this book, the voice of Marcos, and sort of the voice of the writer is I don't know if masculine is the right word, but I mean, it has a gendered sort of code to it. And you can forget at times that the author is a female or is a woman writer, right? And so that, and I was thinking about, what would be the difference of reception if this book had been written by a man. I mean, I think it was written by a woman with the intention of sort of exposing sort of some of, how men objectify women. And I think that like that's an intentional choice that she makes. So I think it's obviously being written in an ironic sort of fashion, but there has been a lot of sort of critique in literary theory over the last several years about what like South Park, right? South Park is a show that sort of tries to like make an ironic commentary on things like racism and sexism, but often employs those devices to do that, right? And I think this book employs a lot of misogyny to sort of expose it, right? But I do wonder, like, what would the reaction have been had a man tried to do a similar type of critical lens on that practice, right? That it might be written as like, it might be seen as like a dark fantasy of some sort, so yeah.
Aaron, you had some thoughts on the Mengele type scientist.
I just wanted to bring her up. I didn't have any particular thoughts. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure she was mentioned before we tapped out.
So a couple things before we wrap it up. We never promoted Mike's book, which is Another White Lies.
Yeah, and I should mention that it's still in the development, but my publisher, Madville Publishing, in the cover illustrator of my book, we're going to do a graphic, I don't know if it'd be a full novel, graphic novella, I guess, a short graphic book based on the story of Percy. It's going to be sort of an update of that story that's written that's written in the future using the same characters. And so that's in development right now. I still need to write it, but my publisher has just published a graphic novel that's doing pretty well, and she wants to do more of that. And thought that
Sounds
story would
pretty
work
cool,
well
yeah,
with
I
some
like it.
illustrations. So
I think
the
your story lends well to the stories
yeah.
lend well to animation
So
or graphics,
yeah,
drawings.
so we're hoping sometime in 2025, late 2025, is the deadline we're trying to hit for that. It's still very early in the
In the process.
talks phase. Yeah, so
We
so
should
the
also
talk.
mention that big fan. If
Yeah,
you're then you might run into big fan while you're out bar hopping.
yeah. I'm in a band in Houston called Big Fan. We're playing at a club called Trip Six next weekend. And
Awesome.
we got an EP that should be coming out soon. We actually recorded it a year ago, but our drummer
Awesome.
got oral cancer.
Oh, shit.
He has no more cancer in his throat now, so we're he still
Great.
has to do a few more screenings, so and some other things that are going on with
Fantastic.
his body, but we're hoping that he's healed up and good to go, and we're playing
Ready
shows
to
again.
rock.
So that's yeah. So we had a kind of hiatus, but we're back doing things again, and yeah. So and then the book is Judgment Day and Other White Lies, came out in 2021 I'm sorry 2022, and that book is um, a collection of short stories, sort of retellings of Greek mythology,
Right.
and yeah, and
Yeah.
so yeah,
It's a
and
very
so
cool book.
Yeah,
yeah,
it is a
so
very cool book. Aaron, the other thing I wanted to bring up is that Aaron, you didn't lay one of your between the covers
Oh,
uh, on us. Go ahead and
this is Between the Covers.
yeah. All right, yeah, we got to do that. All right, so those are okay, Mike. So we've added something to almost all of our podcasts, but it's really up to the guests whether or not they want to participate. We call it the Elite Eight bracket,
okay.
and it's sort of an homage to our friends that run their bracket shows, Maniacal Music Musings, the other Evening at the Movies, Bracket Bastards. So, are you game?
Sure, yeah,
Got a few minutes? It'll only
yeah,
take a couple minutes.
yeah, that's fine.
I've come up with if we've gone through the show here, dystopian movies.
Okay,
So we got it'll consist of an Elite Eight, then a Final Four, then a final,
okay.
just like the basketball
We get it.
tournament. The latter stages, yes, the latter stages
So
of
what's the first matchup?
All right, here we go. Soylent Green versus Planet of the Apes.
Um,
BOG Charlton Heston, Planet of the Apes.
Yes, good call, Aaron.
yeah, I'd probably go Planet of the Apes, although I do find Soylent Green to be kind of funny. It's like,
Well, they're both Charlton Heston, aren't they?
I
yeah.
think so. Yeah. Where do you lean, Aaron?
Planet of the Apes.
Okay, that'll be a sweep because
And
Planet of the Apes was huge.
and the park where the MASH site is also where they filmed Planet of the Apes.
Really? Okay. Well, it seems that that was like the beginning of like action figures, big,
Yeah,
you know,
lunch boxes.
yeah, big concept, big scope movies, Star Wars era, Planet of the Apes. All right. 1984 versus A Clockwork Orange.
The movie or the book?
The movie.
The movies or the books?
These
I'd
are
go
the
I think this is
These
the
are the-
rare thing where I've seen both books or read both books and seen both movies.
I mean, I think it would be Clockwork Orange for me on both counts. So,
Yeah.
personally,
that's
yeah.
another sweep. Okay.
I'd go Clockwork Orange on the movie, 1984 on the book.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it'll be Clockwork Orange though, because I'd vote for Clockwork Orange too. Irregardless, but we are talking
Pretty
about the
true
movie.
to the book, truer than I'd have thought.
Yeah, it changes the ending, but well, the book also was like released with two endings. It's an interesting.
It seemed like a rite of passage. It seemed like Clockwork Orange is something that when you're young and like at least during our era, it seemed to like jibe with the Who, classic rock. It seemed to have a
Yeah, I really liked that movie a lot when I was a teenager. And I think there are some things in that movie that I think nowadays I might have more critical lens in how I viewed it, right?
Yeah.
But I do think that it's, you know, Stanley Kubrick is a pretty great director, and he has a pretty interesting vision, and it comes across in that movie in particular. Pretty
It's kind of a
strongly.
train wreck, that's for sure. But-
Yeah.
All right. The Hunger Games versus Blade Runner.
Oh, Blade Runner for sure.
Yeah.
Blade Runner, especially the director's cut of Blade Runner, is one of my favorite movies. I really like that movie a lot. So
Well,
yeah,
I've done a terrible job of creating controversy because I'm going to go Blade Runner.
Yeah.
These all have been sweeps so far, but
Yeah.
it'll get tougher.
Blade Runner.
Now this one, I
What,
know
what was it going against? I forgot it already.
the Hunger
Hunger
Games.
Games.
I haven't seen the Hunger Games.
Yeah. All right, so I think Mike will have a strong opinion on this one because it was his movie from 1985 on our rotisserie cinema.
Okay.
Brazil versus Apocalypse Now.
Oh man.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'd probably still go Brazil, but I really like Apocalypse Now. That's a good movie. Martin Sheen is really good in that movie. But yeah, I'd probably still go Brazil. Terry Gilliam is one of my favorite directors. I like his stuff a lot. So
Okay.
Yeah, I think I got to go Apocalypse Now.
Yeah. Me too.
all right.
I love
This is
Brazil,
being yeah, I didn't like Conrad's book. Joseph Conrad.
Oh,
Heart of Darkness.
Heart of Darkness.
I just
liked it.
found it. I can see why if you're into dystopian fiction that it's kind of a classic, but I found it really, really dull.
Heart of Darkness is actually a pretty good example of sort of what I was talking about a few minutes ago in terms of irony, right? Like how does irony get used? Because you know, Conrad was writing that book as sort of a critique of sort of, you know, it's written about this sort of ship voyage that's going into Africa to extract resources and critiquing that.
Congo.
Yeah, and critiquing that practice. But in the context of doing that, Conrad also puts forth a lot of sort of racist views of Africa. So so it's, you know, he's critiquing the practice of using racism to go extract resources, but then using racism himself to like overcome that. And I think that book was probably more well received, you know, 30, 40, 50 years ago than it is now and currently in the English department. I mean, people still read it because he's a pretty good writer. But there are a lot of problems with that book in terms of how it portrays some of the local populations and how it talks about certain things that are happening in the context of that. Yeah.
All right. Well, okay. So here we go to final four.
It's also like 100 and some years old, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. No, it was written in a
Visionary.
different time. Yeah.
All right. So our final four leads off with Planet of the Apes versus A Clockwork Orange. Getting a little tougher.
I'm gonna go Clockwork Orange.
Okay.
Yeah, Clockwork Orange.
Maybe not so tough because I'm going to Clockwork Orange too. All right.
Dirty Apes.
And the second matchup is Blade Runner versus Apocalypse Now.
I'm gonna go Blade Runner.
Yeah, I think I got to go Blade Runner too.
That is a tough one for me. I love Apocalypse Now. I'm going to go with that just as a cursory nod, but Blade Runner actually wins the place in the final.
I will say, going back to that, I think that Apocalypse Now is a interesting. It's an interesting adaptation from a book. It's not a straight adaptation. It's more of a thematic adaptation, and I think it's well done in that sense. I think it's yeah.
Well, I'm a big Doors fan. I like the Doors. So our big final here is A Clockwork Orange versus Blade Runner.
I'm gonna go Blade Runner.
Got to go Philip K. Dick here, I think.
Yeah.
Blade Runner.
Blade Runner it is.
Yeah, I really like Blade Runner a lot. I think that's and I think that actually, you know, it has some resonance with this book we read in some ways, right? It's you know, I mean, they're
the replicants and the
cattle
kind of
it's
the
head.
It's a beautiful movie. It's an old movie that looks freaking fantastic.
Yeah,
you know,
and we
right
should.
screen.
I should point, or I always try to point out to people that if you watch Blade Runner, you should really watch the director's cut version. The director wanted a different ending than the studio gave him originally, and I think that the director's
Different
vision
beginning
of
too.
yeah, different beginning as well. And I think the director's version is better, and most critics tend to agree with that as well. So
Like
they,
the sequel from a couple years ago.
yeah, I thought it was pretty well done. It wasn't as groundbreaking as the original was, but um it was well within the style of Blade Runner, and did did a redo of that world in a pretty interesting way. Yeah, but I think the original is a masterpiece. It's like I said, it's one of my favorite movies. I really like it a lot. And again, it's a lot of those same themes, right? It's like what makes what makes someone a human, right? And I think like kind of as we're wrapping up here, kind of to think about that's the question that this book gets across. Like um, obviously humans are, there's a biological component, there's a real material, thing that we categorize ourselves as humans, but but also there's this ideological component to humanness, right? We have humanities programs in colleges, right, that are like, what does it mean to be a human? Why, what is our role in the world? How do we find ourselves sort of floating on this rock through space, right? And what does that mean for us? And I think that in terms, I mean, throughout history, right, when you go back and read, the founding fathers trying to write about slavery in the Constitution or things like that, right? That certain people are granted humanness, right, and certain people are not, right, in a lot of societies. And so, and I think that Blade Runner is like
some people are 3/5 of a human.
Yeah, and Blade Runner, like this book, right? Blade Runner does it from a different angle. Blade Runner has these robots called replicants that are, they have all the biological machinery of a human being in a lot of ways, but they're robots, but they can still feel, they can still think, they can do all those things, and the way
They
they're
don't
treated.
even necessarily know they're robots.
Yeah, and so does, because they're robots, does that give you does that give you license to treat them in a certain way? And so I think that that's like, that's the overarching question that I think empathy, right, is a in many ways is a political project, right? So learning how to have empathy for more different groups of people, more different types of things in the world. I mean, I think that as we're sort of wrapping up on the book here, I mean, I think that a lot of these political struggles are really about that, right? There was this event that happened in Iran. Israel bombed an Iranian consulate, sort of unprovoked. I mean, it's hard to say unprovoked because these countries have long had tensions, but they bombed an Israeli consulate in Syria, sort of off the cuff, and Iran sort of hit them back. And there's been a lot of sort of the ways that we portray Iran in America. George Bush famously called them part of the axis of evil, and I think that this is not to say Iran has a lot of problems, right? But we often point the finger at these other countries and say they're evil, and they don't promote human rights and that sort of thing. And then
That's the oldest trick in the book is
and then in our own country right now, we have police being sent out to sort of attack college students. So I think you could do the same thing with us if you wanted to point that finger inwards and sort of focus on what's happening in your own culture, right? And so that we create these sort of bad guys, and it makes the world this really sort of simple, or the world's not simple, but it sort of has this effect of simplifying the world, right? And so and out of that, right, out of September 11th, right, comes this sort of huge wave of Islamophobia, which has influenced a lot of what has happened in the Middle East over the last 30-40 years, right? In terms of like who is a terrorist, who's not a terrorist, who has the right to attack somebody militarily, who does not, right? It creates these sort of questions. And so
it's kind of become that kind of society, pointing fingers. But
Yeah.
I feel like we tastefully, if you allow me to say, I think we tastefully treated tender as the flesh. At least as much as possible.
Yeah.
And I think we had a very good conversation. And I think that Mike, of course, I assume will be back with us for too long.
Yeah, and so at some point we'll do something else. I'm sure we have a couple
music.
other people that
Yeah,
have books planned for the book part of it, and yeah, and I like doing the music episodes as well. Those are always fun. So
we're setting up a movies of 1987 too.
yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
The
Really
movie
cool.
ones.
Rotisserie cinema.
I like the rotisserie cinema. They're just a little more difficult for me because it just involves watching a lot of
yeah.
movies, and I don't
Oh
have
yeah,
all
you
the
sit
free
there.
time.
Yeah, sometimes your turn don't come up for
Yeah.
20 something,
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's the watching all the movies. It's
It's just hard to find time to do that.
Make it like we should give it like at least 90 days, I think.
But anyways,
I
it was
agree.
good. It was good seeing y'all, and thank y'all for indulging me in this book.
Good
and,
to see you.
and
Yeah.
sorry I put y'all through it.
Oh, no, I enjoyed it.
All right.
So my
All right.
grandkids are they're on their way to Fresno to watch the Savannah Bananas take on the party animals, the team they travel with, kind of like the
the real the adult bananas.
yeah the real Savannah Bananas are playing in Fresno today. My grandson Austin's travel team is the Moore Park Bananas. They have little tiny bananas uniforms, 8 and 9-year-olds.
It's funny.
And about half the team's going up there for the banana ball game.
The Houston trip. Well, it's actually Sugarland, but Sugarland is just a suburb of Houston. We have a AAA ball club that they just renamed the Space Cowboys, and
yeah.
and I thought it was a missed opportunity to name them the Gangsters of Love. Which
yeah, absolutely. You can still call them that. But yeah, but banana ball's weird. It's
yeah.
Hey, Lisa.
There's a batter who always wears stilts. They might pitch off a trampoline.
Right.
If a fan catches a fly ball in the stands, the batter's out. They're always singing and doing musical numbers.
Maybe they should be a traveling globetrotter baseball team.
Well,
That's what they are. Yeah, they're in Fresno today.
Oh, okay.
That's where my
Let me know
grandkids
when
are.
come here. I want to go.
I'd enjoy that for sure. Baseball fan.
Absolutely. I wanted to apologize for my absence. I'm on a new medication. We're going to leave it at that.
Okay. Do you have any final thoughts on the book or anything else you wanted to add before we wrap it up?
I do feel that the choice of Blade Runner kind of, touches on the like, for instance, the hunter kind of falls for the replicant that he's hunting.
Yeah.
And doesn't it turn out in the end that the hunter was a replicant? I can't remember. It's been so long since I read the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think
it's open-ended.
And that brings us to the idea of like, there was a recent movie with not Maura Tierney, one of the sisters, they're twins. And she's in this movie, and she is sent by the government. There's a secret project to create like androids. And she's sent by the government to evaluate this teenage android who has killed one of her handlers. Okay. And her job is to decide whether or not to kill the android. And at the end, it turns out she herself is an android.
Yeah.
So it's kind of one of those things where do we become the evil that we perpetrate?
Well, and we should mention that Blade Runner is based on a book called "Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep?" that was written by Philip Dick. Short story, really. And
I enjoyed that short story. I didn't realize Blade Runner was based on that.
Yeah, Blade Runner is based on that
interpretation.
Yeah, it's not
same character names and everything.
Yeah, and Philip Dick was the writer of Tender as the Flesh has been quoted saying capitalism, cannibalism are synonymous, and Philip Dick was pretty anti-capitalist writer as well, and so a lot of his work take aim at this. So they're I think that the resonances are more than just and I don't know if this particular writer likes Philip Dick or not, but I would imagine that she has some similarities just in terms of worldview with him. Yeah, I mean he's a highly
Asimov.
Yeah, he's a highly influential writer too, in terms of the world building sort of.
He and Vonnegut are my two favorites.
Yeah, I do want to clarify something with you before we go. In the 1984 versus Clockwork Orange debate, Somebody, I think Aaron, you mentioned the book or the movie. Would your answer be different with the
I gave
books?
different answers.
Yeah.
I said movie Clockwork Orange, book 1984.
I agree.
So yeah, I'm just not the biggest. I'm not the biggest Orwell guy. I don't hate Orwell. I think he's a good writer. I think that 1984 is one of those books that, because of its cultural place, is bumped up on the spectrum. And I think there are some other dystopian novels that I think are just more poignant and better delivered than that one.
We were in high school in 1984 and had to read it then, so it's
yeah,
different for us maybe.
Yeah, there's a certain disconnect.
Yeah,
it was speculative fiction when it was written.
That class is one of the
1948.
most memorable classes
Yeah.
from high school. It's like I've retained more from that class maybe than a lot of other classes.
Well, and you did better in that class. You got, it was your favorite English teacher, right?
No,
Oh, that was a different English teacher?
I think it was Miss Ottaviani.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I have her too.
Yeah.
Well, I know we actually
Not that I dislike Miss Ottaviani.
met with his English teacher, the one that sent him for awards and put him up for writing and got him into the who's who for writing and things like that. So
yeah.
Mhm.
All right, guys.
All right.
Well,
Well,
you had a heart out, so we should probably let you go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry.
All right. Have a
all
good
right, well,
day.
nice
Bye,
seeing y'all. Yeah. Goodbye.
Yes,
Have a good one.
thanks. Bye.
Yeah, Aaron.
Bye.
Yeah.
We have social.
Twitter,
Yeah, pod.
Instagram,
Yeah, pod.
Facebook.
Yeah, pod. So let us know. Hit us back. Have a great week.